You've spoken often about your upbringing in Seattle and your Filipino-Alaska Native heritage. How was your art influenced by your heritage, your oral traditions, and your upbringing?
I grew up in the Seattle area, sort of outside of the community, for, the Tlingit community. And my great-grandmother moved down from Sitka in the 20s when she was widowed, and then she remarried a Filipino man and then moved the entire family down to Seattle. So that's how I ended up down here. And, through the connection with my great-grandmother, and my grandmother, who was also full-blooded Tlingit, was the connection that I have and felt. Did grow up very urban, but when I discovered glass blowing, and it was basically as more or less a job to support my music habit, as I like to put it. But then I was trying to look, for my own personal style. And so then I thought about looking to my cultural background, and that's how I ended up doing what I do. Mostly like this mystique about, having, 100-year-old great-grandmother. And she often talked about, where we came from. And my aunts were also very, very, involved with the tribal community and the Filipino community. And, my great-grandmother was recognized by the Alaska Native Sisterhood, the Grand Camp, that to establish one of the camps here in Seattle. At first, it wasn't recognized by the Central Council, but then after time, this being the second most populous area of Tlingit people, outside of Alaska, then they recognized it. So, that was something that, again, the urban experience, definitely spending a lot of time with family. That's what sort of, kind of ingrained that idea in me.
So I understand you studied glass blowing in Sweden, right? Is that correct?
So to set the record kind of more correct, I guess, I traveled to Sweden with an Italian master glassblower, and we were doing demonstrations in Sweden, well, throughout Scandinavia, Sweden and Finland. And I met a woman there, and she became my wife eventually. So I did go there and lived for about 6 months in Sweden. And that was, kind of trying to convince her that I was the one and that she should come marry me. And so she did. And that was in 1995. I lived there for 6 months, and to immerse myself in the Swedish culture, the European culture a little bit. Just so when she was finishing up graduate school, I ended up getting a part-time job in the university blowing glass. And what I did was I helped some of the students in the art school, help them with their glass blowing projects. So in a sense, it was kind of observing, the culture of design and glass a little bit, so yeah, studying on my own accord, more or less.
What prompted you to include Tlingit influence, or was that something you felt from the very beginning?
Yeah, I started actually working in the Tlingit designs in about 1988.
Okay.
And then it wasn't really till about 98 that I really sort of broke out with it and started to really develop it. But I think also, the time I spent in Europe, living there for that 6-month period, very brief period, it was very interesting because, I always thought of myself as something other than just average American. I was Tlingit, I was Filipino, multi-ethnic. But when I went to Sweden, I felt very American. I felt collectively American.
Right.
So when I came back, I I really was analyzing this whole thought process about it. And I really wanted to, I mean, I guess, you know, life got serious and so did I. I got married and I kind of abandoned my musical aspirations as far as it being a career. And then I said, you know, I really wanted to understand my own culture more deeply. So I went about, you know, working really hard at it and finding people who could help me understand it, you know, understand the design system, understand, you know, the mythologies around it and put it in a cultural context. There's a lot of issues about, you know, intellectual property in Alaskan Native culture. So I had to understand what it is that I was working with. So that was part of the, you know, the education that I had to seek out.
European influence had an American feel for you. Obviously, form, line, and design has a Native American appeal or background. Does the work itself therefore then take any European influence or Swedish influence specifically, or how would you describe that?
You know, I didn't go to art school, and I just fell into glassblowing. So I really was reading about art styles that interested me. You know, it led me to the surrealists and the modernists into the whole genre of primitivism. Primitivism was, you know, the modern artists that were reflecting on this, you know, primitive cultures, right? Native American, African, Oceanic, and they were making work that, you know, was inspired by, you know, our culture, very indigenous cultures. So it was kind of like an unlearning of their confines of their Western art approach. And so it was really fascinating for me because, you know, here coming from an indigenous perspective, I was really cultivating and then looking at, you know, modern art and, you know, the fact that Native art never gets really included in the context of modern art, right? Mm-hmm. So there's all these like incongruous things that, you know, I'm trying to make sense of. And so that's in the roundabout way, that's how I came about doing what I do.
Does art influence culture or does culture influence art?
I think it goes back and forth. Kind of dovetail from the last question about, you know, European art. Also, you think about the material right. That using is non-traditional. But I feel like glass brings another dimension to indigenous art. I've worked with lots of indigenous artists from around the world, you know, from New Zealand to Australia and Hawaii and, you know, as well as around the country. And so I feel like, you know, we're as in contemporary Native artists or indigenous artists, I think that we have to kind of develop our work for the commercial market. I mean, there's obviously things that are very sacred and ceremonial that we wouldn't really incorporate in our work every time. And so I think that it goes back and forth, honestly. It you know, especially when you're navigating into newer materials, as you adopt those things and you adopt that, you know, different mindset. There's a completely different mindset about blowing glass than there is to carving a piece of wood. So it's natural that you have to keep this balance. Glass blowing also has a lot of forethought into it. You know, you have to think 3 or 4 steps in advance just to achieve a shape that you're trying to make. And then, you know, then the way that I treat it with the sandblasting and, you know, the stencil and drawing on the piece, you have to rethink a lot of things.
Thank you.
So how has your process changed, if at all, during the pandemic? And do you see changes for coming?
It's funny, I once saw a meme, an artist, you know, before quarantine, and there's like somebody sitting there with a paintbrush on their canvas, and, you know, artists during quarantine, there's an artist with a paintbrush on the hands. I mean, the thing is that, you know, very different for me is that I actually have to work in teams.
Right.
Know, when I'm blowing glass, then once the piece is blown, then I can draw for, you know, days and weeks and months. So I have a lot of work that was already prepped and ready to be drawn and designed on. So for me, I just found a lot more free time, you know, I mean, a lot, or uninterrupted time, I guess I should say. This whole time has been less meetings, less phone calls, less correspondence, and what have you. But I think that it's also become very introspective, I think, for all of us. And that is certainly the case with me. And, you know, the things that have gone on, I mean, unfortunately, I've lost my father a little over a week ago. I mean, my mother's still alive, but they were divorced. But, you know, I had to process this whole, you know, and it's still just like 10 days ago. I have to process all of this, you know, when you lose a parent, it takes a big piece of you with them, you know, it just goes away. And so now what I've decided to do is to kind of mythologize my father in an art narrative. And so I'm working on some pieces now. Just came to me. This is the one thing that I can do is create artwork, and you know, that kind of goes back to the original intent of our artwork is to kind of be an oral tradition and represent a life around us. So that's kind of what's going on right now.
I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you for sharing and expressing how you will live on in your pieces and homage will be paid. That's beautiful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Often you work collaboratively with other artists and you commission artists to help with fabrication. Is it difficult for you to navigate between collaboration and commission?
I work collaboratively with carvers, you know, I'll design a pattern that's then carved in wood by somebody else. And then I can use that pattern to make a glass sculpture. Usually I try to direct the narrative around the objects to tell a story. I have been navigating into other mediums. So I'll have pieces cast in bronze. I'll have pieces cast in glass. And when I'm doing the glass patterns, you know, these glass totem, that's pretty straightforward. It's sort of like, you know, where the art kind of ends and the science kind of begins, because there's a whole process of making these things, and it's not a real artistic process. It's more of just like a craftsmanship thought process. And so once you are a glass maker, I mean, I call myself a glass maker. So now that I understand these different processes, it becomes, you know, pretty easy to conceptualize things and then find the right people who can interpret the ideas. So that just kind of expands, you know, the capability and the styles that I work in. You know, when I'm working with other Native artists, usually I'm sort of being an ambassador of glass to other artists. And I like working with Indigenous artists, you know, because I like to show what the possibilities are. I teach on occasion, but I don't teach frequently. But this is a way that I can kind of do a high profile project that, you know, a lot of people will see, and thereby showing, you know, the capabilities of the material and what we can do with it. Oftentimes when I'm working with other artists, sometimes they'll challenge me and I'll have to try something I've never really tried before. So that's always kind of fun, because, you know, there's a little give and take there. And sometimes it pushes me into a realm that I didn't ever imagine that I would go. As a painter, I mean, you don't necessarily have to collaborate with anybody. You don't have to agree with anybody. You don't have to get along with anybody. So with glass blowing, I mean, we work in teams and we're very close. We're very close friends, and we, you know, help each other, assist each other. And I'm very comfortable with that process, working with other people.
Can you just speak to how the spiritual part of the work affects the product?
I was working with an elder named Walter Porter, who was from Yakutat, and he was a mythologist. He took the Tlingit stories and he broke down the symbolism so that it could be understood from many, many different points of view, compared to theology and compared to philosophy and what have you, and other mythologies from around the world. But one of the things that he contended was that, in our older culture, we had this ability to image in our minds. We didn't have, things to look at, or televisions or phones to look up information, but we had this imagination is where a lot of these objects came from. One of the things that he would quote is the Bible, of all things. He said that, Jesus said, "Look at the lily, it neither spins nor toils." And that is the artistic process. It becomes a state that you put yourself into. Right. And as I'm drawing, sometimes I don't know exactly what's going to come out. Sometimes I'll just start to put lines down, and then I can start scratching away at it and say, "Oh, okay, this is the direction I'm going to go with this particular piece." And then sometimes I'll go into the very focused idea about maybe a story that I would like to try to interpret, or an aspect from a story, because any action within a story can become a piece of art. It might result from kind of a dream, or I'll do a sweat lodge when I can, or I have a sauna in my basement. I'm sort of getting that those kind of juices flowing in terms of relaxing and meditating and allowing the creativity to come into you.
Do you accept requests for art pieces? If so, do you ask that they be based on Tlingit work, or does the request come in and you create whatever you feel is appropriate?
Anytime, this is how the process works. You present your artwork and they select you, then you go in for an interview, and then you meet the stakeholders. You understand, where the setting is that the piece is going to be installed. And so every time I'm trying to bring some aspect of what they're looking for. Like, for instance, in Anchorage, I did a piece for the Boney Courthouse. So I, came up with the idea of painted form line, but in bands of color. So we have like the sunrise. So it's like this bands of color. On the balcony is this design that looks like a sunrise, and beyond it, lime green and purple, sort of like the northern lights. And so in this building that was quite austere, and it was very, gray and wasn't a lot of color. So now we brought all this color into that space. The more recent one that I got is in the public art job was in Seattle, and it was right next to a water treatment plant. So I came up with the idea of Raven and Petrel. Raven stole all of the water from this natural spring that Petrel was guarding. And then, he tries to fly away, and he's so engorged with water, it starts to dribble out, and it becomes the rivers and the streams. And so those are the ways that I try to read into the site, and what they always call them the stakeholders, like what would they like to see and what would resonate with the space and the intent of the location.
When did you first decide, this art thing, you touched on it a little bit earlier, but what was that moment like?
It was like 1988, and I'd been blowing glass since 1982. So by 88, I started to dabble in the form line, like tracing designs out of books and carving it into very simple dishes that I would blow these forms and then put, markings on them. Everybody that I worked with, they were more from the European tradition, more like design and vases and vessels and things that were very, very, finely crafted, very well-made objects, and, architectural lighting and all kinds of things like this. So my work was kind of reflective of that style early on. And I kind of, was in denial about doing the native stuff, for a long time until after I got married. And I said, you know what, this music thing's not working out for me. I'm just going to have to stick to the, with the glass blowing. And I was so established, with my community and my team. So it was about 1997 or 98 when I had my first show with a gallery in Seattle. And then I made about 12 different objects that were all based on Tlingit, culture. And some of them were bowls, and there was a hat, and then there was a cylinder that became a totem. Very simple, rudimentary things like that. And then lo and behold, I sold almost everything. And so it wasn't great. It wasn't really, really good. It was just, the first pieces that I ever made. And I was learning as I went. But I think what happened was that people recognized that there was something more personal going on there. And so I started to make these hat forms, and I made many, many of them. And they were very popular. And so I was able to get a foothold financially, and I was able to, afford to continue to make glass and develop my work. It's just, building it brick by brick, it's just what it took. And I worked, really, really hard for, 20 plus years, and was working 6-7 days a week. And then the next epiphany I had was when I went down to Santa Fe and I started to show in the native art market down there. As a contemporary, I'd go down there and I'd see these people that were, selling pottery forms for like $20,000. And I was like, holy moly, I had my work down there, and it took a couple of years. And then finally we brought a glass blowing portable glass studio down to Taos, New Mexico, and we did a glass blowing demo. And then, so we, I put the piece away, and, the crowd was like, oh, they're like walking. And then they walked into the gallery and they said, I'll take that one, I'll take that one, I'll take that one.
Wow.
They just started buying it off the shelf. Like all of a sudden it clicked in their heads, and I was like, wow. I mean, the education process was really at work there. And so in the end, I remember walking away from there like going, oh my God, maybe I've arrived somehow. I've found my niche. I've found my my rhythm, and I thought, this could, really kind of establish me in my little niche,
Mm-hmm.
And over time, more and more Native people getting involved with glass, and that's really exciting to see.
Could we say that you were the progenitor, that it was because of your work that a lot of it has started?
Well, I think I was a part of it. I didn't start it per se. I mean, the oldest, native glass artist that I know of, Larry Avicana, out of Barrow, Alaska. And then Tony Hohola really took to glass blowing, and he's Isleta Pueblo. Tony was, in my mind, one of the earliest, pioneers of, native glass blowing. And then there was others, that did kind of design it, had other people make it, which, is perfectly acceptable in the glass world. It was definitely part of it, not like the originator or anything, but.
Some say your work is more modern than traditional. Do you agree with that, or how would you argue against that?
I think it's definitely modern. I think the longer that I work with the material, the more traditional it becomes. I'm able to get more and more close and true to form. Okay with it being modern. It's not traditional, and it's not used in ceremony. I think it brings another dimension to, as I said before, to Indigenous art, and that's good enough for me. We as Native people are sometimes dictated to, okay, this is traditional and this is not. Okay, so you people never did this before, so it's not valid. So who's making those assertions? It's like the dominant culture, that's saying that. And, sometimes we say that to ourselves, as Indigenous people would say, talk to most any elder, they're going to be like, oh, that's good stuff you're doing, and you keep up the good work, keep it up. They'll be like encouraging you to do new things.
My grandma is one of the last native speaking people in my community, and she has always, like, I would go to her and ask her permission, like, can I do this, Grandma? And she's like, yes, we want you guys to do this. We want you to do this. And so that's great.
Right. You talked about the free flow of space and it's important to how artists perceived. So can you just speak a little bit about how space around the pieces affect perception and what it is you're looking for in an installation?
The most recent show that I put together, Raven in the Box of Daylight, was the biggest, example that I've done to date as far as like installation in relation to, mythology, storytelling. I create video backdrops. I created a soundscape and used Tlingit language to illustrate this whole Raven in the Box of Daylight story. So as you're walking through it, it becomes like an experience. I wanted to put the viewer in the shoes of absorbing the story as you're walking through the exhibition. Right. I've always liked sort of old world technology, like the vaudeville. I always thought about doing like the vaudeville version of it, where you have like these mechanical things on stage. There's water that's like moving, and I wanted to do that, but then I ended up working with a video artist who helped me kind of put the elements together to create effects that would be like motion or transformation, or the sun rising when Raven releases the sun, or things like that. So I thought that would be kind of a cool way to bring everybody into the feeling of it, like create like an Alaskan landscape backdrop or something. I like, conceptualizing theatrical kinds of experiences. I've always kind of dabbled on it, in it, like maybe not so effectively at first, but it's finally coming around to being kind of interesting now.
As a professional actor, we talk about it's not submersion what we do is, but we help you suspend disbelief. Right. And that's what I hear about that exhibition. Right. Okay. Is there an installation, exhibition, or piece that really calls to you, speaks to you above all others?
Being, a Seattle guy, but Tlingit background. The pieces that I made for the Walter Soboleff Center were pretty special, because for me, we're talking about the whole idea of traditional and not traditional. They specifically wanted one of my pieces in the center, and so I decided to make this big house screen and these two house posts, that clan house interior performance space. So. And that to me signified like an acceptance of what I'm doing. And so that was a really big thing for me, because, when you grow up outside of the community, you're always looking to sort of be accepted by it, right? My biggest fear was that I was going to be criticized for what I was doing, and, oh, it's not traditional, you can't do that stuff, and this is a clan. So I spent a lifetime kind of building up my idea of like a defense around it. This is part of who I am, and this is part of my family background, and it's easy to see, or it's easy to find. If you question it, it's right here. It's still in Central Council. My grandmother, my great grandmother, and my mother they're all registered, and so it's still a matrilineal connection that pretty much stops with me as far as, that goes. But yeah, that particular piece, the fact that I had that opportunity to take my entire lifetime of experience to bring that special piece to that place was a big deal for me.
You've been talking about music throughout this interview, and in a lecture, Professor Mehner noted that you described yourself as more of a frustrated musician.
I'm a musician trapped in the body of a glass artist. That was my original line, but it would have been my chosen profession if I had a choice. I didn't have the discipline or the sacrifice to just like, okay, this is the only thing I'm going to do. I certainly probably could have, but I was really distracted with the glass blowing, which was also an evolving art form around Seattle area. I always did play music, and I, took a couple years off until, I got fully, fairly established as a native artist in glass. And I thought, I want to do music. And so I started a group called Little Big Band. And I got some native people involved with that. And so it was kind of a hybrid of like native and, soul, bluesy kind of souls. The more current band is more, a little more serious now because we're making records and recording and what have you. So that's fun to still have that. I've always been inspired by both activities, and one kind of feeds the other. I mean, I'm constantly listening to music while I'm working, listening to all kinds of different music and, researching and finding new music, from jazz to African music and, avant-garde and, noisy rock stuff to hip hop and, just everything. Yeah. Current band that I have actually, incorporates a lot of these kind of mythologies and storytelling and, languages. We use Tlingit and Haida language. We got to play with Stephen Blanchett. So he brought his Yupik language. The forthcoming album's going to be out probably next year. So it's kind of like the musical version of what my art is. It's part of my artistic expression is what I like to say. And I take it more seriously than I should. I really enjoy it, and it's a lot of work, but it's really fun when it's happening.
To talk a little bit about your relationship with the Northern Folklife Festival and what it was like to be named Poster Artist of the Year.
Yeah, that was super fun. And my bands performed there probably like four different times, 4 years, different years. And so, yeah, it was really fun. Fortunately, of course, this year was COVID, so we couldn't have the festival. It was a virtual festival. They did manage to pull it off quite nicely, but that was really sweet. I mean, I just love those kinds of things. So it's a folk music festival, which incorporates, world music, blues music, jazz music. It's a very amazing festival.
And you want to talk, if you don't mind, a little bit about your honorary doctorate from University of Puget Sound.
That was really, really amazing because I didn't go to college, and yet I still got the best education that I could through the experience that I had working with these professionals and the people that I met and had a chance to learn from. You couldn't duplicate that experience that I had today. So it was the best university I could have gone to, right?
Right.
And so I always put it this way. I mean, it was a real honor to me to receive that. But the first honor that I received, and I was really grateful for this, was in 2000. And Joe David, who's Nuchanolf, and he's a respected elder carver, right up there with like Robert Davidson and, These guys opened up my eyes to the sweat lodge ceremony and indoctrinated me in that. I was helping him at the Pilchuck Glass School. So he was an artist in residence and I was his artist assistant. We built a sweat lodge. We did 4 sweats. You know, at the end of the session, we were all getting ready to depart. He ended up like sharing his name with me and kind of adopting me. And, you know, that was like a major endorsement, you know, by a respected elder. And so that was really huge for me. When the honorary doctorate came, that was sort of like, okay, so the Western world's now also kind of validating my life experience. And it's funny because I kind of forget about it. I mean, I like it when people recognize it. I also think, you know, it's just one of those things that looks really good in the Western world, you know. I don't know that it's really changed my life, you know, dramatically, other than it's a cool thing, a cool experience and an honor.
What message would you like to pass on to the next generation of Tlingit artists? Any words of advice, caution, or inspiration?
You know, to get a solid foundation in your artistic practice, I think that, you know, cultural knowledge, you know, feeds into that. And, you know, to always be bold and brave, you know, and sharing your work with other people, and getting feedback and knowing where to go for the correct feedback. Our community needs more young people to become really, really good at making these designs and understanding the stories and being able to keep this culture alive. And, but it doesn't happen overnight. It probably takes 20 years, honestly. But we have a lot more access to information these days. When I started glassblowing, we were developing special techniques that we learned from the Venetian glass blowers. Today, it's more widely known because people go to YouTube and they blow these things that are very complicated. When I was first starting, we didn't know how to do that or steps that you would take to do it. But today you see these, you know, people been blowing glass for a couple of years and they're like making this really complicated stuff. And they're like, whoa, that, you know, I wasn't doing that, you know, till I'd been blowing glass for 10 years or whatever. So, so it's possible, but you have to be smart about it. And you can't escape the time factor that it takes to get really good at any one thing. And the old adage of like 10,000 hours is, you know, is very true. You have to really, really remain focused and persevere. If I could have continued on as a happy little glass blower, you know, with my team and my friends and working with my friends but I wanted to dive a little deeper, and that's what caused me to look at my own cultural background. Every person comes to a fork in the road, and they, you know, do you go left or you go right? And those are the influences that you're bringing into your life. And so at the end of the day, it was the most fulfilling thing that I could have done, because it did bring me closer to community, my family, history. So, you know, to be able to operate on that level is really, really exciting. You know, it's adding to the conversation. There was a good friend of mine who was, you know, from Lummi, from Washington State, and he said, "How did you allow yourself to be so successful?" And I was like, well, I don't know what you mean by that. And then I was always thinking about that.
Yeah.
Because he was having a hard time bringing that kind of success into his own life, because he was a violin player and a motivational speaker and a storyteller and all-around great guy. This Swill Canham is his name. If, you know, some high school or elementary school asked him to come and we only got, you know, $50 for you, he'd go do it, right? And so a year later, when I said, you know, you asked me this question one time, And I didn't know how to answer it. He goes, oh, don't worry about it. I answered it for you. You know, some of us are just out there, you know, doing it. And you don't realize it, you don't think about it, but people are watching what you're doing and they're taking note. And so you don't really see it, but you're kind of a leader in some ways, without really declaring that that's what who you are. Mm-hmm. Then I took it a step further and I said, if I'm successful on any level with my work or with my career, then I will have inspired the next generation to do something different, right? It's like what I do is different than what the tradition was. Maybe they're going to do something even more different than what I did. Maybe they're going to be working in concrete or steel or who knows, but it's going to be, you know, keeping the codes and the symbols of the land alive. And that's what our people need.
That was beautiful. My last question is from the other side, not from the artist's perspective, but from the observer. What question or feeling would you hope that people who are experiencing your work, what question would they have, or what feeling would you hope they could take from it?
Well, I hope that, you know, when someone sees my work, you know, they're maybe, you know, surprised and delighted, you know, that it would cause them to wonder and ask more questions, you know, so it has strong references to the culture, even when I go abstract, creating something that is hopefully inspiring. Most people are attracted to Native art because of that reason. Sometimes it has a story and sometimes it doesn't. As Joe David likes to say, it's wonderfully non-representational. Some days you have good days and bad days. Some days, not everything I do is you know, a masterpiece, you know, but it's, you know, still like that process that I'm working to get into the flow. The more you are able to design things, then you get, you know, hopefully better and better at it.
Thank you so much. That was really inspiring, and I feel really honored on behalf of my group to be able to have done this. I really enjoyed this a lot.
Absolutely. Did you want to share the name of the new band?
The band is called Ku'ik. It means potlatch in the Tlingit language. So it's sort of like an invitation to a feast, you know, potlatch. But it's also like a sharing of culture, sharing of music and dances and stories, you know. So that's like that reciprocal thing.
Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, it was genuinely appreciated.
Thank you for thinking of me, and good luck.